Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Williams, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so special, they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore and maintain these special places, which are then open for you and I to enjoy 365 days a year. Places like Shanks Ferry, Kelly's Run, Otter Creek, Climbers Run, Hellam Hills, Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us all better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format for tonight's lecture is a 40-minute presentation followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to have them answered at the end of the presentation. This is the fourth lecture of our 2022 winter-spring season. Our next Nature Hour will be April 6th, where we'll talk about and explore the beauty, bounty, and biodiversity of forest gardens. We also have a number of in-person events planned for this spring with multiple nature preserve interpretive hikes, a number of opportunities to give back to nature through volunteer events, and our annual meeting on April 21st. You can learn more and register for all these events on our website, lancasterconservancy.org, under upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support. And tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors, who include Clark Associates, Stauffer's of Kissel Hill, Lakshwama, Electron Energy, Dart Container, Eurofins, Ritu, and Penstone. The generosity of our sponsors make our work and Nature Hours possible. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, Biking with Butterflies. In 2017, Sara Dykman became the first person to follow by bicycle the eastern population of monarch butterflies on the round-trip multinational, multi-generational migration from Mexico to Canada and back, 10,201-mile adventure on a beat-up bike was a call to action. Sara says that the monarchs need us because they can't call politicians to demand healthy prairies or rally for natural gardens, but we can. We might not be able to fly like butterflies, but we can bike alongside them and be their voice. And she wrote a book about her adventure. I learned about this book from one of our outreach volunteers, Bernadette Chiemba, who's a wonderful writer in her own right, and she loaned me her copy. I read the first chapter and went out and bought my own book because it's an amazing work. So Bernadette, if you're out there, thank you for turning me on to this work. It definitely combines a travel memoir and popular science. And so Bicycling with Butterflies was printed in April of 2021 by Timber Press, and it recounts Sara's inspirational ride alongside the monarchs. She encounters a cast of characters that include eager school kids, devoted citizen scientists, skeptical bar patrons, fellow bicyclists, climate deniers, unimpressed border officials, and of course, millions of monarchs. Sara passionately shares the urgent plight of monarchs and the complex science underpinning their dwindling numbers. The book is filled with optimism, energy, and hope. It's a compelling story confirming the urgency of saving the threatened monarch migration and the other threatened systems of nature that affect the survival of us all. Sara says it's part science, part adventure, part love letter to nature, and she hopes readers will come away with a deeper sense of connection to the land and be inspired to join the team taking care of our planet. Sara Dykman is the founder of beyondabook.org, which fosters lifelong learners, boundary pushers, explorers, and stewards. She works in amphibian research and just returned from Ecuador on an amphibian expedition that I'm only a little jealous of. She works in amphibian research and as an outdoor educator guiding young people into nature so they can delight in its complicated brilliance. She hopes that her own adventures, from walking from Mexico to Canada, canoeing the length of the Missouri River from source to sea, and cycling over 80,000 miles across North and South America, which includes the 10,000 miles in this monarch migration trip, will empower young and old to dream big. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation and thanks to everyone who's helping spread the word. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about monarchs is monarchs connect us to folks in Mexico and to folks in Canada. And often I'm connected to people and, you know, a few months or even a few years down the line, I think, wait, how did I meet you? And the answer is always a monarch. So I'm just so appreciative of everyone tuning in and letting those paths and those connections continue to grow. Like Keith said, thanks for that introduction, Keith. I'm going to be talking about my bike tour And I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about basic monarch ecology, and then I'm going to jump into some basic bike touring, the basic bike touring 101, and then tell some stories from my trip, talk about some lessons the monarch taught me, and then answer any and all questions. So if you think of a question while I'm talking, put it in the chat so you don't forget. And with that, I want to introduce probably the most important player or character of my story, and that's the monarch butterfly. I could have done this trip without monarchs for multiple reasons, but for folks that don't know, this is a male monarch, and you can tell he's a male because he has the 2 black dots on his hind wings. Those are scent pouches, and he is nectaring from another important character in the story of the monarch, which is milkweed. And there's about 70 species of milkweed in North America, native to North America, and the monarchs will nectar on most of them, or if not all of them. But monarch adults, they're generalists. They'll nectar on just about any native flower and even any ornamental flower they can find. But what makes milkweed so important is that it's the only food source of the monarch caterpillar. And milkweed is poisonous. It gets its name from the milkweed, the latex sap. So if you tear a little bit of milkweed, most species will leach out this white sap. And when I would do presentations to kids, I always would stop here and say, it is not milk. It looks like milk, but it's actually poison. And the monarch caterpillars can deal with the poison, store it in their bodies, and then that renders them poisonous. So this bright orange monarch is warning potential predators. I'm poisonous, be careful, don't eat me. Now, the other probably most fascinating part about monarch ecology is their range. And don't worry if you can't read all the words on this map. The important part to note is that there's 4 colors. Yellow denotes where the monarchs live in the summer, green is spring, orange is fall, and then blue, which is way harder to find because there's way less of it, is their overwintering range. And so you can see monarchs spread out during the summer months, and then in the winter they congregate in these clusters that you've probably seen photos of or maybe even visited. And they're these dense clusters that are really magnificent. And I have a few pictures of those later on. Now you'll notice that in the Rocky Mountains, it acts kind of like a fence, and it divides what we call the eastern population from the western population. Population on a scientific level means genetic distinctions, and the eastern and western monarchs are not genetically distinct, so they are technically one population. But for the sake of talking about monarchs, most people refer to the eastern population as all the monarchs between the Rocky Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean. And those monarchs most overwinter in Mexico, and they overwinter right on the state line between Mexico and Michoacan. And that's where I began my route. So the red line is my route. I started in Michoacan in March, and I went north into Texas, all the way up through the upper Midwest. I went all the way over to the East Coast, and then slowly made my way back south with the fall migration. And there's 2 things I'd like to note here. And first is the monarchs that I started with in Mexico were not the same monarchs I finished with. So what happens, and what is just sort of mind-blowing in my opinion, is that the monarchs in the fall, the monarchs born in the fall, they emerge in sexual diapause. So rather than about 4 days after becoming an adult butterfly, instead of beginning to mate, they stay sexually immature, and they will fly to Mexico, where they'll spend all winter waiting out winter, and then in the spring they'll fly north again. So that generation, often called the super generation, has to live between 6 and 9 months. Now, when they arrive in the spring, they will lay their eggs on milkweed, and then they will die. And those eggs will metamorphose, and that will be the first generation of the season. And it will take about 3 generations to populate the summer range. Those monarchs don't live as long. As an adult, they only live about 2 to 6 weeks. So when I was biking, let's say when I was biking in doesn't anywhere in the South on the fall migration, I would have these moments where I would see a monarch and I'd think, did I meet your great great grandma at some point on this trip, or did I see your grandma as an egg in Kansas? And I'll probably say this multiple times in the next 30 minutes or so, but the monarchs truly connect us all, and it's so important to remember that, because we can't just protect one little spot of this range. We really need to protect all of their range if the monarchs stand a chance. So this is a true team effort. Now, the other thing I'd like to call the attention to is all of these squiggles on the red line. And pretty much every single one of those squiggles is due to someone finding out about my trip, either word of mouth or about maybe an interview I did with a local media, or maybe a presentation I gave. And they would call me up or email me or message me, and they'd say, hey, I have a garden. Do you want to come visit? Or, oh, I'm a teacher. Do you want to come present at my school? Or, oh, I work at a nature center. Do you want to come to our nature center? And as much as possible, I always tried to say yes. And sometimes there were exceptions to the yes rule. Like sometimes I'm like, ooh, do I want to add 2,000 miles to my route? No, not only do I not want to do that, I can't. But as much as possible, I said yes. And this was truly the point of my trip. It wasn't really about biking the entire route. It was about being the monarch's voice and speaking to as many people as I could about the plight of the monarch and how we can all help. And I'll get to that, don't worry. But first I want to talk a little bit about bike touring for folks that don't know. This is my setup, and you can see my bike is nothing special. It's actually just an old mountain bike that I built many years ago from used parts. And I love this bike because it's heavy and sturdy and strong and reliable. And also because it doesn't look fancy, I can lean it up against a grocery store, outside a grocery store, and I can go in and buy groceries and really not worry at all about someone stealing my bike. Most people are like, that looks like trash. It's not. Now on my bike are panniers, and the front ones are store-bought panniers, and in them I put my sleeping bag, sleeping pad, computer, book, journal, light. I basically would describe the front of my bike when I would do presentations to kids as my office and my bedroom. And then in the back, I have what are old kitty litter buckets are recycled into my rear panniers. And there I had my tools for basic bike repairs, a stove, fuel, and usually I would try and carry about a day's worth of food. I'd also have on the back here, the red thing is my tent, and the blue thing is a little folding camp chair. And during presentations, I'd tell kids, I'd ask kids, who here thinks that I carry a sofa on my trip? And of course, no one would raise their hands. And then I'd pull out my camp chair and they'd all roll their eyes and be like, that's not a sofa. But I ended up doing a lot of office work in my tent at night because it took a lot of work to schedule presentations and to plan for media events. And so I would spend a lot of time on my computer at night, and that chair was a lifesaver. Probably it was not necessary, but probably my favorite luxury. Now, when it's all said and done, because I have everything packed on my bike, I have an immense amount of freedom. And so when I showed you that red line that was my route, I didn't know where I was going to go most of the time. I had a general destination, in 3 or 4 days, I needed to be at so-and-so's house for a presentation. But in between, it was just it was up to chance and fate and who I would meet and all sorts of things. So I often didn't know where I was going to go that day. And I certainly never knew where I was going to camp. But because I was set up like this, I just didn't have to worry. So I would eat when I was hungry. There's my cooking setup, and I would camp when I was tired. And this is a very classic camp spot. My tent is hidden by a tree there, and then the car is going right by. That's the highway I was biking down. And this is in Texas, where there's no public land or hardly any public land, and property rights are religion. So I spent a lot of time on road easements and kind of hiding in plain sight. And often people hear this and they are so worried for me and scared. But I have to say that I always feel the safest when I'm in places that are unexpected, because I know that people aren't gonna drive to a campground, and make a mess or make noise or be bothersome. I'm in a place no one would expect and no one would find. And by the time the sun would set, I'd be reading my book or working, and no one would possibly be able to find me. So I felt really safe. The other thing about this way of traveling is that it bonded me to the experience of the monarch. So I think people forget that travelers need a place to stay every night. And I think often people forget that monarchs are travelers. But by traveling myself, I know exactly how important it is to find a safe place to sleep every night. And as we develop the United States, as we continue to convert prairie to farms and prairie to parking lots, it's getting harder and harder for monarchs to find that. And I felt that viscerally, because there were nights where I would bike for 2 extra hours trying to find a spot. And it was stressful and certainly, disheartening. But then there were nights where I'd find exactly what I would need. And I imagine the monarchs had those same experiences. Another great way about camping is your house is always clean. You just lift it up and shake it out. And you find so many creatures just randomly. So I left Mexico on my bike looking for monarchs, but the monarch was often just an excuse to notice all the other creatures living in the same habitat. And so I could appreciate, wow, I found skunks and snakes and strange pollinators that I'd never noticed before, and birds. There was just so much diversity waiting for me. And when I'm in a car, I don't see most of these creatures. And even if I do, by the time I've it's dawned on me that I've seen someone, and then I've found a spot off the road to pull over. Well, by then it's like, oh yeah, that's like 2 miles to go. I can't walk that far back. So you just miss out on a lot. But biking is that perfect speed where you see a little toadlet crossing the road and you can stop immediately. And thanks to my beat up bike, I could throw my bike on the ground, no problem. And then have this interaction with this little toad. And actually it's funny because while I was looking for this toad and I took some pictures of him, so I was laying on the ground to get eye level, a car like skids up, not skids, but comes to an abrupt halt and runs over to me because they thought I had crashed. And that happened multiple times, maybe too many times. That maybe I need to make a little sign or something. Another reason to bike tour is the encounters with humans. When you're on a bike, you are completely vulnerable, and that vulnerability opens you up to invitation. So this man I met in Mexico, and I was biking on this road. I would describe this road as long and hot and boring. And I honestly would not remember any more than that it was long, hot, and boring, except for that this man stopped me. And I remember when I heard his motorcycle first, and then I see him, and as he's getting closer, he's slowing down. And I'll admit my first reaction was, oh boy, what does this guy want? And then he stops and he's like, hey, do you want some ice cream? And the say yes rule applies especially to invitation when I'm on the road. If I feel safe, I always try and say yes, even if it'll slow me down, even if it's not the most convenient thing to do at the moment, because this is where the stories are. This is where the memories are made. So I'm super grateful for this ice cream. But it wasn't just impromptu ice cream. Ice cream is definitely one of the characters in my story. When you're biking, I was biking about 60 miles a day, so I could eat plenty of ice cream. And this is another special ice cream story that I won't ever forget. And this is Margaret, and she was a friend of a friend, and she had a dairy farm, or has a dairy farm in Canada. And she sent me an email and said, hey, do you want to come to my dairy farm? And I said, sure, that sounds perfect. And so I showed up. It had been about 2 days of rain. I just showed up a sopping wet mess and had a warm shower. And I came out of the shower and Margaret said, hey, do you want some homemade chocolate ice cream? And boy, it was so good. And by that point, the sun had come out. and I staged this photo. And of all the photos of me eating ice cream, I chose this one because, again, this is like such a perfect example of how my story and the story of the monarchs line up really nicely. Because here in the foreground, Margaret is feeding me ice cream. And then in the background, that's her backyard. And who is she feeding? She's feeding pollinators. And so I love this idea that the nights that I arrived to a house and had a warm meal and a shower and a bed were the same nights that monarchs arrived to the same houses and had everything they needed as well. So I really feel for the monarchs, and I just know how important this habitat is. Now, most of my trip was biking. My trip was 10,201 miles. And because of that, I was alone. So I was biking and I had lots of time to think, too much time, one might say. But I got really, really good at spotting milkweed and then looking for caterpillars on the milkweed. And my strategy was first find the milkweed. So in this photo, there's me, obviously. And then right here is some common milkweed. And I would look at the common milkweed, and there'd be usually too much, or when there was a patch, to inspect every leaf. So I would look for like the monarch calling card. And there were two. And I'll zoom in on this monarch so you can see. There's two. One is those little nuggets, which are their poo. And the scientists call, I'm sorry, I described them as a nugget, frass. And then this is not the best example of this, but in this way here in the back, you'll see a little hole with white dots around it. That was the other calling card. So if I either saw a hole with the white latex sap of the milkweed dripping out, or if I saw frass, I would slow down a little or pay more attention. And that's when I would see caterpillars. And in this example, I'll go back to that previous picture. You can see this is a staged photo, but this is exactly what would happen. I'd see a monarch and I would slam on my brakes and I would jump off my bike and be throwing it down before it had come to a stop. I don't know why I can outrun a caterpillar, but I'd always just be too excited. And then I'd run into the ditch and I'd start looking. And this happened so many times a day if I was lucky. And I could spend literally hours crawling around these roadside ditches. There is so many amazing things happening. And so if I zoom back in, one of those amazing things, and this is just one random story of thousands, is that I watched this little caterpillar. This is a 5th Instar caterpillar. So I say little, but it's actually about as big as they get. And he was grabbing his frass in his mandibles, and then he was kind of going back and forth like a crane, and then he'd throw the frass over the side of the leaf. And my guess is, I haven't confirmed this, but my guess is that he was getting rid of that frass because just like I use the frass to kind of hone in on him, other predators could do the same. So he was probably trying to kind of make it a little less obvious he was there. And wow, remember, this is just happening like 12 inches from pavement, from roads where cars go by at 60 miles an hour. And wow, if we could just all slow down a little and notice those really remarkable feats that are happening, I think we would be more appreciative of nature. We'd be certainly more inspired to protect nature. And I think we would be less distracted by all the things that could distract us. But here's the problem with seeing the world through the eyes of a monarch is when I would celebrate finding a caterpillar on milkweed, and then a few miles later, I would come across someone mowing down this habitat. And in a lot of cases, roadsides are the last habitat for milkweed and thus for monarchs. And I will admit that I got pretty angry on my trip. And I think it surprises people for me to say that the hard part of my trip was not biking. It was not the miles. It wasn't the heat. It wasn't the hills or the rain or the headwinds. It was always the hardest part was dealing with reality and having to process the fact that our planet has been changed and that so much of the monarch's habitat has been stolen, quite frankly. And it wasn't just the roadside ditches. It was everywhere, every mile, every place I went. We're talking about huge lawns in front of schools and suburban lawns and residential places and even monoculture cornfields everywhere. And then excuse me, and in these photos, at one point that was all the monarchs' land. That was where the monarchs lived. That was their home. And we've decided that we don't want to share. And this is where my voice has been the loudest, is in telling people that we have to learn to share. So everyone with a green grass lawn, I know they're trying to do their best. I know that what they're trying to do is be a good neighbor to their human neighbors, because this is what we've decided is beautiful and is safe and clean and orderly. But in doing so, we have completely forgotten our bird neighbors and our frog neighbors and our milkweed neighbors and our snake neighbors. And we need to learn to be good neighbors to more than just humans. And so my trip became about celebrating native plants and about reminding people that we can share. And so the reason for this is because the monarch population has seen dramatic declines. And again, don't worry about the numbers. This is the monarch population since 1993. Don't worry about the exact numbers. All you need to really worry about is the general trend. So all populations in the wild fluctuate year to year. That's totally normal. There's good years and bad years. But typically, a sustainable population will go up and down, but the trend will be level, meaning that over time, the population's stable. If you look at this, you can see a really dramatic decline. And in fact, there's this green dotted line here that's a little difficult to see, but that's where scientists have decided that the population is stable. And we haven't seen the population reach a sustainable level in, wow, quite a while, over a decade. And so this is a problem. And the reason for this decline is primarily due to habitat loss. If you imagine, even on a year where there's very few monarchs, excuse me, there's still millions. And if half of those are females, and if every female lays between 200 and 500 eggs, we're talking about the need for billions of milkweed. Because if each of those females laid multiple eggs on one milkweed, which is called egg dumping, which they'll do if they can't find enough milkweed, you can imagine what would happen. Excuse me. The eggs would hatch, and then they would become caterpillars, and they would mow down the milkweed, and there'd be not enough, and they would starve. So instead, what the females do is they'll try and lay one egg per plant. So we need billions of milkweed. And often I hear this idea that the way to save monarchs is to collect those eggs and to rear them inside or rear them in cages. And I think that this is a fine idea for people to do one or two so that they can watch the metamorphosis. But we need most of those eggs to not survive because we need them to be bird food or spider food and frog food and bird food. So the way that we're going to get these numbers up is to provide enough milkweed that there can be lots and lots of eggs laid so that most won't survive, most will become bird food, but at the same time, we'll have lots and lots of monarchs. Now, I say all this and I can every time I give a presentation, I start talking about green grass, I feel my heart rate go up and I start to get flustered. But I think that it can be all overwhelming. And I'm not just talking about monarchs, I'm talking about climate change in general. I'm talking about turning on the news and hearing sad story after sad story about the state of our environment. And people often ask me when they see graphs like this, when they hear about the plight of the monarch, they ask if I have hope. And it's an interesting question and one that I'm not sure I actually know the answer to. But what I do know is that I feel much, much better if I'm doing something and if I'm surrounding myself with other people that are doing something. And I would say that if I had no hope, I would not have been able to do my trip because I would get so angry biking down the road that had just been mowed. I would cry when as I'm like picking eggs off of milkweeds that were mowed down and putting them on new milkweeds. And it just feels so depressed and isolated and sad. But then I would meet people. And so I want to transition from the doom and gloom to pretty much the reason why I kept going. And like I just kind of said, one of the reasons was because I had a purpose. And I really think that the best medicine to this climate change despair is to go out and do something. And for me, that was be the voice of the monarch. So I presented to about 9,000 kids, mostly kids, on my tour to talk about science and adventure and changing what success means and what status quo is. And I always felt better after these presentations because obviously kids are the future. And someone just gave me, wow, I'm gonna detour a little here, but a friend just told me the most beautiful metaphor, because she was thinking about how we were talking about how the monarch migration is multi-generational, and not one generation completes the entire loop. And it's going to be the same with the monarchs conservation. It can't be one generation that's going to save the monarchs. So in a lot of ways, I felt like I was giving the next generation the tools they needed so that they could continue. And I met so many incredible people on my trip that were from generations before me that were kind of passing the baton to me. And I just love the fact that just like the monarchs connect us all across the world, they also connect us to just so many generations. And so speaking of, actually not, I forgot I had this photo. The next photo is of an older person, but these are still young people. And one of the things that gave me lots and lots of hope on my trip was visiting school gardens. This is a garden in Omaha, Nebraska. And these kids, we ran out across the parking lot to this little stretch of land that they'd turned into a little native prairie. And we were looking for eggs, and we were learning about milkweed because someone ripped a little leaf and the poison came out. And oh my gosh, it was so dramatic that we had all touched poison. And I guarantee that these kids will remember more about science and the monarchs from these moments in the garden than any book could possibly give them. And then of course there was this incredible moment where a monarch an adult male drifted over our heads, and one kid spotted him, and then we all spotted him, and we all just start screaming, and we're so excited. And that monarch would not have been there had it not been for that garden. And who knows, maybe one of you guys has seen a monarch that exists only because of this garden, or vice versa. Again, the monarchs connect us, and we all have a little piece to play. So that was a major piece of hope. And if you all are near a school or have kids in school, if you can make one of these gardens happen, it is so influential and so needed. And it is so much work, I won't lie. To maintain these gardens is a lot of work, and to convince administrators is a lot of work. But if you can get through that, wow, it's so worth it, and the monarchs will thank you. So here's one of the people that kind of is passing the baton on to the next generation, and that gave me so much hope and really motivated my trip. This is Bill. He runs Native American Seed Farm in Junction, Texas, and I stayed with him on the spring and fall migration. And I will tell you, there's nothing more exciting than being hot and tired and hungry and going down the driveway of Native American Seed Farm and seeing rows of milkweed growing like corn, and then getting to the end of the driveway and Bill's daughter coming out, Emily, and she says, "Oh, hey, Sarah, let me show you to the guest house. Oh, and by the way, I've stocked it full of food for you." I was like, oh my gosh, what a treat. And on a tour of the farm, we saw so many monarchs. And so what happens is, or what happened, I guess I should start with why this farm came to be, is that Bill was a landscaper in Texas, and he was planting non-native grass and for homeowners. And one day he was just like, I live in Texas. Why am I planting a plant that needs water and fertilizer and pesticides and mowing? So he started learning about natives, and he began growing natives. And so what he does is he grows the natives and then harvests the seeds and then sells the seeds to gardeners and other landowners that want to start converting their pasture lands and lawns to native. So super influential and super cool guy. There's also these little moments of hope, and they came from like people that I'll never be able to thank, but just like seeing them was so profoundly important to me. And this was a little section in Iowa, and Iowa was probably the center of the monarch migration, and now less than 0.01% of the remnant prairie remains. 0.01%. So most of the monarchs' home is gone, and so the monarchs are relying on these just little tiny plots of land, like islands in the sea of corn and roads and lawns, to find refuge. And this one, the sign said native prairie, no mowing or spraying, and it was just a little short thing. And in fact, it kind of looked like it had been converted to mostly willows in this picture, but all the same, that little bit of habitat is habitat, and that little bit means something to the animals living there. And then there were folks, this is Diana, she lives in Sioux City, and I focused on Iowa because biking through Iowa was a mind game. It was so much corn and not very many monarchs, and it was really kind of the height of my despair. But then I rolled into Sioux City, and I went on a tour of this prairie, which is right outside, or it might even be in city limits of Sioux City. And in the 80s, Diane and her friends had fought to protect this little bit of land, and I just can't thank them enough for that. And I hope that I can do things for the next generation that also bring them a little bit of hope and a little bit of solace in a world that often feels like it's falling apart. And on this little tour, we saw milkweed, we saw monarchs, we saw little ringneck snake, and all of those animals owe their existence to Diane. And so again, I just think, wow, if you can fight for land like you are, that is so meaningful and so important. And then there are the gardens, the lawns, or the backyard gardens. These are probably some of my favorite gardens of my entire trip because they're so important. I don't know if some of you might have heard of Doug Tallamy. He wrote Nature's Best Hope, and his whole premise is if we converted our lawns to native, it would be the largest national park in the United States. And we think that we can have a lawn and then we can have a wild place and that's enough, but we can't. We have to learn again to share and bring the wild plants and animals to our yards. And this is Amy's garden in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it's such a good example of sharing. So you'll see she's still got a patio, she's still got some grass for the dog and kids, she's still got some ornamentals, but mixed in there is common milkweed. And when I first got to the garden, I was like, all right, that's a garden, I guess. And then she said, I've already seen 40 eggs on these milkweed, 40. And even if just one of those survives, and then that's 500 eggs in the next generation. And if just a few of those survive, and in a few generations, we're talking about 1,000 extra eggs that wouldn't have existed without this milkweed. And so every single garden matters. And I've said this about the garden in Omaha, but there is a chance that one of you has seen a monarch that exists only because of this garden. Wow. Now, this is a small garden in a backyard. My favorite garden that I think I saw on the trip of my trip was when I stayed with Nadia in Columbia, Missouri. This photo, I didn't include all of her yard. It extends beyond her. Her front yard was just a paradise of natives. And there were dozens of walking sticks, and I saw birds and monarchs and all sorts of interesting pollinators. Again, that only exists because Nadia decided to do something different. And I think often we're scared to break status quo. So we put our native gardens in the backyard. but we really need to bring them to the front because we need to change what beautiful means in our neighborhoods. And we need to be that example, a very, very brave example of doing something different. And it can feel like a lost cause, and it can feel impossible sometimes, you know, if a neighbor complains because it's weedy, but there's ways to make a wild garden look manicured, you know, to have nice paths and signs. But it's so important. And the reason I include this picture is because you'll see in the neighbor's yard, there's this little tiny clump of common milkweed. And I asked Nadia about it, and she said, well, before, her neighbor mowed everything. And then their neighbor found out that if there's no milkweed, there's no monarchs. And so they started mowing around this clump of milkweed. So literally in this picture, Nadia's milkweed is spreading, and so are her ideas. And we need an example to spread on every street, in every city, in every state, until people begin to share. And it's possible. And wow, staying with Nadia just gave me so much hope. And every time I see a front yard garden, especially, I'm just so thankful that those people are brave enough to try something new. Now, that kind of helps me transition to kind of a few lessons that I've learned thanks to the monarchs. I really consider the monarchs my teachers, and I think maybe the most valuable lesson they taught me was in Mexico. And this is what the colony looks like when they're clustered together. And you'll see the branches are covered in monarchs. We're talking thousands of monarchs. And this isn't even very many. Like sometimes entire trees, you won't even see a single needle. But what I love, and the reason I chose this picture, is in the background there's one tree, and granted it's a small tree, but it's bending from the weight of monarchs. And it takes 4 monarchs to equal the weight of a dime. But sometimes there'll be so many together that they won't just bend a tree, they can actually break a big branch. And so I think, wow, if there was just one butterfly in the forest, maybe they would move a needle. If it was just Nadia or just Bill or just Diane or just Amy, just Margaret, it wouldn't make much of a difference. But together, their collective effort could metaphorically bend trees. And I am so grateful for the monarchs showing us this year after year after year. And I can extend that metaphor a little farther even. This is what the monarchs in Mexico look like when the sun lands on that cluster or a cluster. And as soon as they warm up to their flight threshold, they'll often launch into the sky and they'll circle. And it's one of the most phenomenal things I've ever seen. But my favorite part is that if it's just one butterfly, you don't hear anything. But when thousands start fluttering around you, you can hear this beautiful humming song. And so I think, wow, if it's just me out there talking, not many people are going to hear. But if I'm talking, and if everyone here tonight shares the story of the monarch with someone that they know, then eventually enough people will be talking about monarchs that our message will be impossible to ignore. And I see that with monarchs are making the news. Monarchs are becoming more and more familiar, and more people are joining the team taking care of them. And that's because people are using their voices. Another brilliant lesson the monarchs teach us is that it does not matter where you live. I went to New York City, and on my way to New York City, I passed through Queens and Brooklyn. And in both Queens and Brooklyn, I saw milkweed in little parks, like one was around a little lamppost. And on those milkweed, I saw caterpillars, monarch caterpillars. And then when I was leaving, I went through Manhattan and I saw this monarch. And I chased this monarch because I desperately wanted a photo to prove that it does not matter where you live. If you plant native plants, the monarchs will come. And so just as I've talked about connectivity, I find it so empowering that monarchs can be saved by kids in cities, by farmers in Texas, by landowners in Kansas. It just doesn't matter. The monarchs don't care. They just need their home. And then the last lesson that I want to talk about before we jump into questions is that monarchs are these just most wonderful guides. And the reason I say this is a male monarch. Again, I don't have to explain why this animal is beautiful, right? It's just extraordinarily beautiful. And he's nectaring right now on another milkweed that you'll often see in yards. The common name is called butterfly weed. And again, milkweed is also very beautiful. Don't need to explain. But what I love is that as people first, as they fall in love with adult monarchs, then they'll want to learn more. And this certainly happened with me. And so what happens is you have to slow down and you have to get in the habitat and you have to crawl around. You can't discover, say, monarch caterpillars and eggs by driving by. So the monarchs kind of invite us to slow down, and then we'll discover their caterpillars. We'll discover there's that milkweed sap. And then we'll discover other caterpillars that rely on milkweed. These are tussock moth caterpillars. They are so extraordinary. If we have time, there's a really cool life history with milkweed tussock moths that I can touch on if we have time. But you'll also just start to discover the pollinators. And I've said this a couple times already, but I think it's worth reiterating. A female monarch will lay 500 eggs. Most of those won't survive. They'll become food for ants and wasps and spiders. But then in turn, those animals that are sustained by the monarchs will become bird food and frog food. So they really are an important part of the ecosystem. And the predators that we often might villainize, I think it's important to see the beauty in them as well. This little googly-eyed spider, man, so cute. And then you'll start to discover other pollinators. Probably my favorite pollinator of the trip was the hummingbird moth. I probably took like 400 photos of this guy. I could not believe how beautiful he was. And I'm like, this flower was inches from a paved road. And then you'll discover all the other creatures that rely on the habitat. My first love is frogs. I've loved frogs since I can remember. I have nothing but good things to say about frogs. And this is a little froglet that just emerged from the tadpole stage, and he was seeking refuge in this common milkweed leaf. And so, wow, if we protect milkweed in the habitat, then we're not just protecting monarchs, but we're protecting all these other animals. And it doesn't have to be milkweed or monarchs that is kind of the driver. Like if you love frogs, go protect frogs. If you love birds, go protect birds. If you love goldenrod or bees, whatever the creature is that calls to you, go out and give them your time and your energy and your voice. And in doing so, you're going to be giving your time and energy voice to all the other creatures. So you don't have to quit your job and get a crummy bike and pedal through Mexico or brave New York City or brave scariest animal of my trip, roadside skunks. All you have to do is plant milkweed and other native plants. And if you do, the true adventurers, the monarchs, will come to you. And so with that, I want to invite people to check out my website, which is beyondabook.org. Lots and lots of photos, stories from my other adventures as well. If you want to read about my story, my book again is Bicycling with Butterflies. And I'm so grateful for folks that tuned in tonight. I'm so grateful for the connections that have led to this moment. And I'm excited to answer any questions if people have some. So thank you.
Wow, Sara, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. As good as your book, by the way. And so folks, I definitely encourage you to pick up Sara's book. It really is just a great story and just so very written in a really marvelous way. You've inspired people to action. So we've got a couple of questions about planting milkweed. One is somebody's got a 2.5 acre woodland tract that's got a number of trails through it. So maybe not a whole lot of open canopy, open space for sunlight to come in. They've got a question about, the idea of planting milkweed alongside those trails. And then a second one that's related is, what's the most successful way to plant milkweed in mass?
Oof. Those are both really good questions. If anyone in the audience is a land manager and has a general idea, my guess or my way is to reach out to local native seed companies and first buy seed in bulk. It depends on where you are. So like I'm in Kansas, and right now people are doing work reseeding the prairie, and they have kind of two tasks. One is to remove the non-natives, hopefully without using chemicals, and the other is to get the natives in there. And it's a long process, which in say in Kansas involves burning and then seeding, and it seems like the advice is put too much seed or more seed than you would expect, and then do that year after year. And it takes time and it takes a lot of energy. Is there anyone in the audience that could answer for a more local answer to that question? Because
I might be able to answer a little bit. So
Please.
we're working on that actively on a number of our preserves. And so a lot of the restoration work that we're doing is actually converting old farm field into pollinator meadow. And so milkweed is one of the multiple species that we're trying to put in. You know, Sarah, you nailed it. Like site preparation is the key, and fighting invasives is a big part of that. Ernst Seed Company is probably our most reputable local source of seed. And I think, you know, one of the questions is, does it require tilling or just broadcasting? In my experience, you got to get really good soil contact with the seed. And so some kind of a till to get bare soil and distribute the seed that way. But Sarah, I noticed you planting some bare root plants in your slides, and maybe that's another way. I mean, that's not going to be broadcast in a large acreage, but on a smaller plot, that might be an option. And folks, I want to turn you on to a resource related to that. So the Conservancy does have a program, Community Wildlife Habitat. And so Sarah, you talked about other neighbors, which I loved, right? So we often think of our human neighbors only, but there's all these natural neighbors, right? The nature neighbors that you talked about, the snakes and the toads and the frogs and all the pollinators. We have a program called Community Wildlife Habitat where it's a volunteer-led program, which is absolutely amazing. It's a free service, and folks that are really expert in native habitat and native plantings will come and visit your property and offer some really concrete guidance and advice on things that you can do to encourage native vegetation, including milkweed, that would then, you know, be that really important habitat for the monarchs. You know, I loved the analogy that you made between your journey and struggling to find a place to stay at night and the monarchs. And I never put that together in the book. I have a whole new respect for churchyards though, after reading your book. So Sarah found churchyards to be one of the best places to find a safe place to sleep at night and a concealed place to sleep at night. Every time I go past the church now, I think of your book. But that I thought was a really profound analogy, that, you know, we're all these living entities, right? And we all need the same basic things to survive. And I think sometimes we forget that point.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And so, you know, you mentioned people in places where we might not think about having the ability to impact in a positive way, this global problem, right? This really is a global problem, multinational problem. And yet individual people in a very urban area, like you said, in New York City, can have an impact on that. Can you comment a little bit more on that idea that every one of us can really influence this in a positive way?
Yes, I mean, I think we forget that our actions are important, and I think it can feel like it doesn't really matter. And I think that the monarch gives us this most amazing gift, because so many of the problems are not solvable with one person going out on an afternoon and buying some milkweed. And the problems are huge, and they need huge group answers and solutions. But in the sea of all of that chaos, and in the sea of all that uncertainty and big picture issues, we can go out into our yard and plant some milkweed and be part of the solution today. And I think, especially for kids, it's so important to empower them to be solution makers, because if you can get a taste of what it's like to make positive change by planting milkweed or planting goldenrod or whatever native plant suits your fancy, then it feels a little bit less impossible to make other changes and to maybe run for city council and vote for a climate initiative. So I think that the Monarch gives us a first step, and we need to embrace that first step, and we need to thank the Monarch for giving us this first step. And it gives us a place to go, because right now a lot of times it just feels directionless, right? Anywhere you turn, there's chaos and problems. But then you can say, no, I'm gonna, wherever I live, it doesn't matter. I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna research, and I'm gonna pick a few native plants, and I'm gonna grow them in my yard. And when everything seems impossible, I'm gonna look at those plants growing and know it's not impossible. Because look, right now I'm doing something. I'm making a difference.
Yes, to me, it's like the democratization in a way of an environmental issue, right? So, like you said, some of these environmental issues are so huge. I feel as an individual, I can't, my locus of control, my ability to do anything about these enormous global problems, or it feels minimal. But for this, I could do so. Even if I live in an apartment, I just have one container on a balcony, right? If I put one milkweed plant there, that's at least some kind of habitat, and I can contribute to that positively. I think that's a really great point.
Right.
We're getting some specific questions about the kinds of milkweed and sources. And so let me just turn folks on to maybe the best place to start, because it's coming up here, is the Lancaster Native Plant and Wildlife Festival. If you go to lankplantfest.com, and I think we might have a link to that on our Facebook page, I believe, or on our webpage, because we're going to be tabling there. That's probably an easy way to get some really good native plant material, including milkweed, from some local producers. And is there a specific kind of milkweeds that's best, or is any species of milkweed okay?
The best is what grows in your spot. So natives are adapted to the local soil and the local climate and the local water. So my recommendation is always find 3 or 4 native species, plant them all. One of them is going to like that specific spot the best and is going to flourish the most. And then every year add a few more. The more diversity we have in our gardens, the more robust and sustainable they are. So if a specific herbivore comes through and likes one over the other, then there's still plenty to go around. And then the other advice I have is, local is local, so I can't possibly begin to know the best in every specific place, but do really focus on making sure you're getting them from native plant sales, like you were saying. Often, like big box stores will sell milkweed that have been treated with, they're called neonics, which is a type of pesticide, and it usually coats the seed and then it's water soluble. So as the plant grows and is watered, the plants uptake that neonic into their stems and leaves. It will actually get into the pollen, and it can actually kill nectaring animals. It will certainly kill an animal that's eating the leaves. So we really need to make sure that the milkweed that we're planting is pesticide free. And then the other little bit of advice that I have, and this was really helpful when I heard it, was be patient. So a kind of a saying that I've heard from multiple people is that natives sleep, creep, and then leap. So the first year your plantings they're going to be doing all the work underground. You're gonna look at them and be like, what? This is native planting. And same the second year, they're not going to make a lot of headway. They're native, so they are relying on creating the infrastructure underground to survive what nature throws their way. And then the third year they'll take off. So I encourage people to start small if it's overwhelming, and then add every year. So every year you'll be having different natives in different stages of that sleep, leap, creep phase, and you'll start getting results. So be patient and have fun.
Yeah, that's an excellent point for sure. So we're just about out of time, and I just want to bring up one more point that I thought was really pertinent that you made, and that is that monarchs connect us all, right? And I certainly feel that, right? That we can all rally behind this conservation cause, and whether that means just one milkweed plant in a pot on the balcony of the patio of my apartment, or converting my 2.5 acre lawn into a native pollinator meadow. We can all get behind this and actually make a really positive difference. And certainly the Conservancy, this is what the Conservancy is here for. right? We protect land for exactly the reasons that you stated, to protect things like monarchs and frogs and toads and snakes and everything else, and then and us, right? I mean, we are nature and nature is us, and without these protected open spaces, we suffer. And so, in fact, we've just announced today that we've added another. We're in the process of adding another 1,100 acres in York County on the Susquehanna River, and so we are moving out as fast as we possibly can. And then, you know, that's the beginning of the work, is protecting it from development. But then stewardship is the next big piece of that. And a lot of our stewardship work goes towards restoring and doing ecological restoration work on former farm fields and converting that into pollinator habitat. And if folks want to get outside and see examples of that, visit Kelly's Run, visit Clark Preserve, visit Safe Harbor, and visit Climbers Run. We've got active meadow restorations going on there, and we would love to have you come out and participate. If folks want more information about what they can do on their own properties, again, check out our website under the Community Wildlife Habitat Program. And there's an email link there that you can use to get some folks to come out and take a look at your property and see what you can do to help not just the monarchs, but every other insect and bird that's in decline. I mean, we're in a significant decline right now because of the loss of habitat. And then maybe, Sarah, you can come and visit folks by bike to the restored properties. So anyway, Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. And thanks for just, you know, doing this and being the voice of the monarch. That's so inspirational. And then doing the 10,201 mile trip to really put, you know, actions where the words are, and all the presentations, 9,000 people that you engage with along the way. And now, you know, another 100 or so here tonight. Thanks, Sarah. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.